Okay, welcome to everyone, and thanks for attending virtually to this seminar, this virtual seminar. My name is Robert Scott, and I'm the incoming president of the San Francisco Bay Area VFS chapter. Ordinarily, in a seminar like this is where we would cover things like chapter announcements, but in the present situation, there really aren't any. But I would like to thank and acknowledge at this moment the outgoing president, Natasha Schatzman, really an impossible act to follow with all of her energy. And she also took the lead in getting us coordinated with the National Office of VFS to get us started in this virtual format to do seminars. So I'd like to thank them as well for facilitating it. I think this is going to be a great talk, hopefully with some new level of engagement of connecting everyone at home. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Larry Young has been a member of NASA Ames for many years, and I think this is one of the most really creative talks that we've had as a seminar ever before to talk about some really different applications of rotorcraft design. Larry, can I hand it off to you now?
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you very much, Robert. Hello, everybody. So thank you for your time. I know that especially in the Bay Area, there's a lot of interesting things going on and some non-interesting in terms of the fires and other stuff. So I appreciate you being able to attend. As Robert was alluding to, this is, stay tuned for something completely different. And the intent is, of course, to make this as an aspirational, inspirational talk as possible. So it's going to be very high level. It's going to talk to a lot of things that have happened over the course of a couple of decades of my research. And hopefully, as I said, you'll find it inspiring and maybe find some opportunities for yourself in the future to look at a variety of things in your careers. So the talk is entitled Rotorcraft is Robots. I'm going to talk to you about what I mean by that specifically. Okay, there we go. Excuse me, a little bit of a problem. So this is not a discussion about autonomous helicopters. That's not to say that these platforms couldn't be and are actually going to be autonomous vehicles, but the focus is not really going to be on trying to replace the pilot when flying from point A to point B. Instead, it's really going to be talking about rotorcraft in the context of being platforms that have some level of capability to transform their nature and to manipulate their environments. And it's also going to be a talk about how these robotic rotorcraft may transport, coordinate, and or work closely, not only as an independent agent, but with a heterogeneous mix of other robots to accomplish those missions. Now, those may be other flying vehicles, or they may be ground assets, they may be passive sensors, a variety of things. But to fully complete the mission, you have to have these platforms working with other assets. So the hope is to get to a point where wholly new vehicle configurations and non-traditional aerospace applications can be made possible by this rather subtle shift in the design paradigm. And this reflects basically over the past 2 decades of my work, and it didn't fully spring out of my head, this overall arching concept. It was really kind of this passive process of working on 1 or 2 ideas, 1 or 2 concepts, doing, some interesting technical work and reporting it. But over the course of time, over the course of those 2 decades, I came to the realization that really this was kind of a new emerging field that I was talking about in terms of this idea of rotorcraft as robots. And so in some part, this will be a kind of a historical presentation, but I think as you go through it, it also will reflect a kind of a synthesis of ideas, global ideas into this overarching topic area. So the outline, I'm going to talk about the objective of the talk. I'm going to promote this idea that there's three perspectives when one is talking about this new application area. And I'm going to give a variety of specific examples of rotorcraft as robots. That'll include planetary science missions. It'll include terrestrial field science and monitoring, public service missions, disaster relief and emergency response, and public transportation. And this is not an exhaustive list, but really what the intent is to show that not all the needs of society have technological solutions, and clearly not all problems require somebody slapping a rotor on it in order to seek a solution. But in many cases, rotorcraft can provide a considerable amount of benefit to our society, both in its conventional manned helicopter versions that are flying now and have been flying for many, many decades, but this future idea, again, of robotic assets that can go ahead and help us achieve various different societal needs, and that's the thrust of where I'd like to be coming from. And then it's always a great thing. There's this tug of war between innovation and technological advancement. So by coming up with new vehicle concepts and new mission concepts and new overarching application areas, they also cause folks to realize that their tool sets and their methodologies are inadequate to the task of really trying to address all problems or all issues related to the development of that innovation. And so one particular example I'm going to put forward is this idea of we have system analysis tools to study aircraft now, and in many cases they're well mature. But in the case of trying to apply it to this idea of autonomous aspects, specifically autonomous aerial assets, they're only at this point kind of rudimentary type of tools. And clearly this is both a challenge and it's an opportunity. And that's oftentimes, a key thing that I always throw out in terms of many of my papers is for every challenge, there's an opportunity in many cases from an engineering perspective. And I feel that this idea of trying to now take something like system analysis applied to autonomy, developing new tools and new capabilities and new methodologies is an important area for the future consideration. Another one that's not on this particular slide, but I think is also equally important, it's not only just merely going to be a cultural shift that needs to be done to try to bring roboticists and intelligent systems experts to communicate with them, with rotorcraft and aerospace knowledgeable folk, but it's also, again, how do you synthesize, how do you fuse together some of those design tool sets and methodologies to come up with efficient and the quote-unquote best solutions for a particular problem. So again, this tug of war between innovation and technology to me is a very exciting thing, and hopefully you'll find that as well. And then just some brief concluding remarks. So the objective of this talk is to hopefully provoke thoughts and ideas as to new application domains outside the conventional aerospace sector. That's not to say that the work that's currently ongoing, but from the bulk of the rotorcraft community isn't important and valued and still an area of significant research. But really, I want people to begin to start thinking outside the box. And that goes to my next objective, which is I really feel that this talk, though it's open to everybody, I'm really trying to talk to in a voice to the new emerging generations of students and graduates to consider this new area and see if it makes sense for them and it's a best fit for them to engage both their engineering talent and their research interest into help move forward. One of the great privileges in my career has been that I've worked with many interns and young engineers over the course of my career, especially the latter half of it. And almost everything that you will see in this presentation and the significant and above what's contained in this presentation has in fact been enabled by working with interns and helping them gain insights in their own ability for innovation, as well as inspiring me and provoking me, if you will, to think even further in the future. So that's the second objective of this particular talk. So I originally gave this talk, a more modest version of this talk about in the 2014 time frame. And it was basically an invited talk to talk to a number of roboticists and intelligent system designers that were at that point just starting to get interest in this idea of, specifically delivery drones, to use that term, but also, again, this notion of, I use a term that I've used previously, which is Aerobots as a part of society. And so that got me to thinking about, how one can discuss the field of rotorcraft technology to those folks, and how can you basically emphasize that there's more out there, there's more potentiality than just, what we are currently doing with the manned aircraft and have been doing for some time. And so I thought that I would tackle this communication challenge by talking at the, organizing the discussion around three perspectives. And the three perspectives that I wanted to talk to was first to talk about the application domain, what is the need that you're trying to address? And then talk about it in terms of the technological capability, what is unique, what needs to be developed, what do you need to draw upon that perhaps is, again, this polar community between information technologists, intelligent system designers, and rotorcraft experts. And then finally is to talk about it in terms of a transportation spectrum. And in many cases, some of the slides will have this little blue box on the side where it talks, what's the application, what's the technological capability, and what is being transported. Not throughout this particular presentation, but you'll see it occasionally. And when you do see it, it's referring back to this idea. I'm trying to come at the discussion, not only just among rotorcraft experts, but the greater community that I see needs to be brought to bear, which includes the roboticists and the information technologists. So first of all, what do I mean by application domain perspective? I touched a little bit about it even as early as the presentation outline. I see it, planetary science clearly for rotorcraft is an emerging area, disaster relief and emergency response, public service, terrestrial field science, commercial applications such as delivery drones, public transportation, and transit in terms of larger cargo drones, as well as some of the VTOL UAM concepts that are now being talked about. Now, this is not exhaustive. In fact, I challenge folks to go out there and think about other application domains that may be of interest. One that could arguably be part of the commercial is that there's a robust toy industry community out there that's looking at small flying vehicles, and there's a lot of interest on that. There are many others. For example, you could have wildlife conservation. We're facing many, significant extinction of species, and we really have to think about not only a behavioral type of response to that, but we have to think about technological responses to that as well. So this is not exhaustive, and again, I challenge people to think about other application domains that might be addressable by this type of general field. Now, the second perspective I like to discuss about is this technological perspective, and this is kind of like a very near random kind of Venn diagram type of thing, where previous discussions within the rotorcraft community in terms of things like micro-rotorcraft, bioinspiration, robotic ecosystems, hybrid systems where they have two different types of mobility, or they have two different types of variable geometry, modular and distributed. All these have been touched upon by both myself over the course of the past 2 decades, but actually have also been touched upon by other individuals with time. And really, I think there are going to be overlaps in these areas. That's why you have the little rings, kind of touching the edges and encompassing some of the problems. And again, there may be other areas, there may be other things that people can argue that from a technology need to be brought to bear into this problem. So for example, I have down electric rotorcraft. Well, what does that mean? In my mind, that means it encompasses not only electric propulsion, but it also encompasses, now that people have talked a long time about having servo flap rotors and active and passive flow control devices that are driven by, in part, electromechanical actuators or plasma actuators and things. All that needs electricity. Well, if you're providing the electricity for electric propulsion, you might as well go ahead and see if you can apply it to all these other additional devices and systems on board the vehicle. In the case of robotic ecosystems, what I mean by that? I mean by that is, these are networks of homogeneous and heterogeneous agents, not just for a single mission, not just for a single flight, but actually reflects all of the systems, both air and ground, that are necessary to not only affect that mission, a single mission, but all the missions that are going to happen occur during the course of the system's life cycle. So that will touch upon things like automated or semi-automated ground stations or vertiports to support the autonomous rotorcraft platforms that may be used for a variety of different missions. And that's a new area I think that people need to start thinking about. And what do I mean about in the case of hybrid systems? And so that's, again, heterogeneous combinations of different configurations, i.e. morphing or variable geometry type of platforms, capabilities. One time we're going ahead and we're flying, the other time we're going ahead and we're trying to do, we're trying to acquire some sample on the ground, or we're doing something on the ground, such as distributing a small package. And modalities, what I mean by that is, again, we have a vehicle that has not only aerial mobility, but it has, some aspect of other mobility, whether it's ground mobility or, waterway, surface mobility, some new vehicle there. And then off to the side, ultimately, I feel that it needs to be integrated into this whole process, is this idea of system analysis of autonomy, this new nascent area of study that I think needs to be worked on, as well, again, as this idea of design process fusion, where now we have to bring in experts that have to date only peripherally touched upon the area of the rotorcraft research community, but really to see the full successful manifestation of this concept, this field of rotorcraft as robots need to be brought into not only communication, but into the active engineering process to come up with, again, the best solution possible. And then I'm going to talk to the third perspective, which is the transportation spectrum perspective, where we are very familiar on the two ends of that spectrum, which is the transportation of information data. The most classic one of that being is aerial imagery. And well, of course, the rotorcraft community is also very familiar about the transportation of people and passengers. In between is this area where there has been some development, and there's folks that are actively working in some of these areas, but I really do feel that we can bring more to bear on those problems. In the case of transportation of goods, delivery drones is one of those. Transportation of resources or field samples, that'll be talked to in terms of planetary science and also terrestrial field science. And then there's this transportation of services. And this gets in the idea where people are talking about using small autonomous aerial platforms as, well, maybe not even small, for like telecom relay stations, also basic networking processes. There's other things that will come to mind as we continue on with this. So this is the first slide. This is, again, has that blue box I warned you about. So in this case, the application domain that I'm going to be talking about first is terrestrial field science and monitoring. The technological capability is now to take a RC helicopter in this particular case and imbue it with some sort of surface interactive capability In this case, you can see here there's a robotic arm that is actually picking up a small pebble. Now that could be a soil sample where there's contamination, whether it's from oil or some other chemicals. It could be looking at biocontamination. It could be looking at microbial and or other flora that's in the immediate area of the place that the sample is looking. In the case of the Arctic, it's particularly going to be important because the Arctic is getting warmer, and so there's going to be a significant amount of transport of flora, in particular from the lower regions of the country up into the Arctic. And so this would be one possible way that you could do environmental monitoring to find out how much of that flora is contaminating, if you will, the Arctic. The other thing about it is, this is, what you really want to do is not just have, again, a single flight, a single mission, a single sample here. You want to have multiple missions. And this gets in this idea that you may also have to have a robotic ecosystem where this vehicle flies back to an automated base, gets swapped out with another aerial vehicle, or swaps out its payload, and then flies again, recharges and flies again. And then the final one is this area transportation of spectrum. And in this case, this would be, specifically this example would be sample acquisition. And the whole intent here is I'm trying to provoke people to redefine what a robotic explorer or robotic assistant might be. And then additionally, I'm trying to redefine what a helicopter is, even what a robot is on this whole thing. And so I'm potentially hoping that new thoughts will be inspired by you guys as I go through this discussion. Now, aerial imaging is a necessary but not necessarily sufficient aspect for a smart rotorcraft field assistant. The idea primarily would be that these could fly in support of people, whether they're researchers or regulatory agencies, whatever. And they provide not only the aerial images, but they're also going to provide a utility that basically you'll help preserve their personal safety so that they don't get into a particularly rough situation, rough terrain, and put their lives and their health at risk. It also helps minimize resources because those assets are basically can fly longer ranges than walking on foot. And then it also can, as I said, provide a long-term persistent scientific presence in the field if combined with automated stations. Now, if you look to the right here, you see two photographs. One is at a ground level by a person taking another researcher, taking a picture of them in an Arctic region. That's kind of the ground truth. And the other one below it is an aerial image of that same basic area. And really, that's going to be a fundamental point where my comment is aerial imaging is a necessary but not necessarily sufficient requirement for these vehicles. Because whatever you do, you have to not only get the image from high, but you then have to apply some sort of ground truth to the whole problem. And that's going to be both, again, a challenge and an opportunity for these type of vehicles. So we've actually done some limited amount in the past of flying small RC class type of rotary wing vehicles in the Arctic to assist in effectively simulated science, Arctic science there. And this is a list, and that's what the picture represents is one of my students from the past, up at Devon Island, which is in the Arctic Circle in Canada, standing to one of the typical rock formations that is in that area. And this list on the left is basically some of the science objectives that folks could end up using these assets for. And the last one may seem to be at the bottom, kind of a humorous type of thing, but in reality, it's a genuine concern and risk that one has to deal with, is making sure that no polar bears come across you while you're doing your work up in the Arctic. So again, some of the operational scenarios here, you get access to elevated and otherwise hazardous terrain. You can do scouting and data gathering, on the bottom right. But perhaps the most important one, as I mentioned, is that you help characterize the site to provide context for specimen collecting. That you you're flying on high, but the geologist is going to be down on the ground. He's going to take a specimen from a rock on the ground, and then he's going to want to relate it to some of the global arching nearby topography to which he acquired that specimen. So it gives some sort of context to what he's doing down on the ground. So all these are things that possibly one could do with, again, this idea of a smart rotorcraft field assistant for doing terrestrial field science. Now, I'm going to transition to a very closely interrelated topic, which is planetary science. By now, hopefully, most people recognize that rotorcraft do have a role to play in planetary science. When I started this work all the way back in 1997, for a long time, I was basically seen as a crackpot. And now it's kind of funny to see people who are very enthusiastic taking it for nearly granted that that this is just the thing to be doing in terms of planetary science. The next couple of slides are really from the early days in the 2000 to 2000 time frame, where we looked at here at NASA Ames, and specifically myself and my students, a number of different potential mission applications. Again, your little blue box. So the application domain is planetary science, and again, it's surface interactive and robotic ecosystem for technological capability, and again, information for samples. So back in those days, it was a very small community. Sometimes it was 1 or 2 people that were looking at this. This was talking about Mars rotorcraft from all the way back in those days. Those who don't know, basically, Mars rotorcraft are very exotic type of vehicles. They have large rotors. They have ultra lightweight structures. They have unique combinations of low Reynolds number compressible aerodynamics for airfoils. They require a wholly new type of propulsion, as is even the very thin atmosphere of Mars, which is about 1% of the atmospheric density at its surface as compared to Earth. It also is primarily like 95% carbon dioxide. So except for some very exotic type of chemistries, you have to come up with some new type of propulsion system. That could be all solar electric, fuel cells, Ackerman hydrazine engine. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a very toxic monopropellant that's used in spacecraft. And or in the far future, when we've developed in situ derived bipropellants, hydrogen and oxygen from the regolith of Mars, basically you can create propellant and use more standard type of, though still exotic, combustion type of technology. Mars rotorcraft have unique stability and control challenges. For example, basically no tail surfaces. Tail surfaces have minimal effect on the controllability of vehicles, and it'll have to have some varying levels of high levels of vehicle autonomy. Now, Mars rotorcraft work, again, it's not just the exotic concepts, it's also the technological capabilities that are necessary to see the realization of that. And so I'm actually quite happy to report that NASA Ames was the very first reported documented rotor hover test at Mars-like densities at a large low pressure chamber that we have at NASA Ames. And you can see in the upper left a picture of that early testing back in the 2001-2002 timeframe. And then you see at the bottom 2 pictures, inside that low pressure chamber, we actually have the benefit of a small test section, cross section wind tunnel that was designed for studies of Mars aeolian processes, i.e. kicking up dust in the boundary layers of the planet. And we were able to gain benefit of that tunnel and be able to effectively do the first rotary forward flight wind tunnel test at Mars-like densities 4 or 5 years ago, just as the early days, so leading to the development of the Ingenuity Mars helicopter, which I'll talk about very shortly. We also then looked at applying some of our work to things like robotic hovercraft to explore Titan, the moon of Saturn. Amanda Lippin, reference down there, was actually a high school student of mine that I mentored that looked at this particular concept. This is important from the standpoint, it had kind of all the right ingredients. It came up with a plausible mission that was very surface interacted. It did look at nuclear power, radioisotope thermal generators to move the vehicle around. And again, it speaks to the power of engaging students even as early as a high school senior and looking at this type of work. We also looked at Ducted-Fan VTOL for Titan, and you see I don't know if the video is coming across on the right-hand side, but this is again early work on this particular vehicle by one of my students. The most noteworthy thing here is there's a huge spectrum of configurations that one could say is a Ducted-Fan VTOL in my mind. And this particular concept, what made it kind of neat, was not only that it had ducts that were tiltable, kind of like the classic, Grumman V2L platform, but these were actually oval ducts, and inside the oval ducts were two rotors that were in tandem, and all told, the aggregate of the vehicle was basically a quadcopter, if you will. So the same basic control laws, other than the nacelle tilt, could be found from the foundations of quadcopter type of flight controls. The other neat thing about that, I happened to see one of the concept vehicles for an Uber Eats platform had a configuration that was very similar to this. Now, I don't know if they're moving with that, but they did at least have a mock-up that did embrace this idea of tilting oval ducts with tandem rotors inside the platform. Actually, I think they actually had, to be quite correct, I don't think they had oval ducts. They had two near proximity circular ducts, but it'd be very easy to just say, hey, go to the oval duct. Venus, the next grand challenge. It's very interesting. It's a near Earth-like planet that, in terms of size, gravity, and yet it went horribly wrong. It has extremely high atmospheric density and pressures near the surface, and it has exceedingly high temperatures, enough to melt lead at the surface as well. Venus has a distinction that it's the first planet which did have an aerial platform fly over it, had balloons that flew much above the clouds at near Earth-like densities and temperatures, and yet the real benefit, I feel, is one day someone getting extremely creative and figuring out how one could do aerial exploration near the surface and have that aerial exploration last more than just a handful of minutes or an hour or two. And one concept that we promoted was this idea of a airship / more correctly, a near submersible type of platform that could fly around. And the vehicle there was actually made out of a thin titanium shell. So again, it's more submersible than it is actually an airship. But if anybody wants a grand challenge, if anybody wants to do some example of extreme engineering, think about how you could try doing Venus. So that up until now, that was the past, and this is now. And NASA Ames, we're privileged within the aeromechanics office to be able to contribute significantly to the Ingenuity Mars helicopter. You can see an image of that at the bottom left. Very active in terms of aerodynamic performance predictions, system integration and test development, as well as flight control and system ID activity. So we were very, very plugged into that aircraft, and we're very proud to see it fly on its way to Mars right now. We, to a lesser degree, had contributions, non-negligible contributions to the Titan Dragonfly, which is a nuclear-powered octocopter that will be flying to Titan. It'll launch in right now 2026 and get there, and I think probably around the 2034 time frame, though I can't recall exactly what that date is. And we helped at NASA Ames, the Aeromechanics Office, we helped with some of their small but critical part of their Phase A study that then allowed them to get the New Frontiers mission select that they did about a year ago, about this time. And additionally upon that, there's hopefully more to come. We currently are engaged, our office, in working with JPL researchers to look at a variety of different rotary wing missions and vehicles to fly on Mars as a potential next generation Mars rotorcraft. And hopefully there'll be more to be discussed about that. One of our researchers, Shanna Withrow, Maser, actually had a presentation of a paper at the last San Jose conference, discusses at least one of those mission concepts. And then there'll be an opportunity at the upcoming November AIAASN conference to have a couple of papers and a panelist perform, which will again talk about some of those notional ideas of what may play beyond the Ingenuity technology demonstration. So now transitioning from science applications and now just more global robotic ecosystems and or public service type of missions. I'm now going to, again, emphasize I'm not talking about robotic ecosystems. I'm not merely talking about a single aircraft, single mission, but a complete vehicle life cycle. And that may entail semi or fully automated bases with fully automated robotic systems to help effect that, to do things like maintenance, recharging, repositioning for multiple sorties, that type of thing. And there's three specific examples I'm going to be talking about is the Sentinel Fire-Spotter, the Aerial Surveyor Earthquake Damage Assessment concept, and the Hopper Metropolitan Aerial Transportation Systems, which back when we did that study, it's not gained the prominence it now has within NASA and outside of NASA in terms of VTOL and UAM. So one could consider this the Hopper network idea as kind of a precursor work that led up to that. So the Sentinel Fire-Spotter is, again, you know, there's a lightning strike, there's fire that develops in the backwoods, there's an automated park station there that contains these quadcopter, in this particular case, vehicles that then is scrambled and then sent out to monitor the fires. It has, as you can see, that copper-shaped package underneath it. It has the instrument payload, swappable payload that can contain instruments. It may also contain critical small supplies that may go to for things like firefighters. And one time we had talked about the fact that you could possibly use this type of platform to get some sort of emergency shelters to trap firefighters that were behind a fire line and all that. So, but the key is it's not just a single vehicle, though I'm not showing a ground station here. It's that whole network of things that have to happen and likely going to have to happen in at least a semi-automated function in order to be able to have this successfully realized as a complete fire spotting system. The aerial surveyor is a notion of taking a kind of a flying wing technology coupled with distributed electric propulsion ideas and coupled with prop rotor technologies and coupled with coaxial helicopter technologies and arrive at a flying wing system that not only uses these propulsion pods to fly around to get the area of a disaster, but also then can deploy some of those pods to act in, to fly down, coast down to lower altitudes to do imaging survey, to look at damage assessments as a consequence of that. And the idea for this particular one is kind of like earthquake surveillance, at post-earthquake surveillance. You know, there's all sorts of neat, you know, aerodynamics that come into play. Again, this goes with my comment about innovation in design, then inspires advancements in technologies. So this is just showing that there's unique aerodynamic performance considerations that need to be taken into account, as well as other technologies such as aero elasticity and things like that. Again, some more pictures here. You have to look at the problem both in terms of its two general modalities of flying wing, and then you have to think of it in terms of its own independent drone that's flying around. And you have to come up with the best mission compromises for both these vehicles. And I really want to emphasize the reason why I have these references down at the bottom of this, and I could do this. I could do the same thing for all of these, gee whiz ideas that I'm showing you right now. The point being is, again, this is some accumulation of, a couple decades of work, and yet a lot more work, a lot more opportunities for people to work on these concepts as well as their own or extensions of these concepts or their own ideas in the future. This is, again, trying to inspire people. Hopper network, again, for those working in UAM, VTOLs, my argument would be that, autonomous vehicles ultimately will be required. And my personal opinion is that these will be scheduled service over well-defined vertiports. I know that there are a lot of people who believe very much in on-demand systems, but this is my personal perspective on that. And then finally, this will require what I believe is a large number of autonomous support systems. So you see here on the right, basically a tandem helicopter to carry a large number of passengers. I believe this was 25 to 30 passengers. But what it has is it has a small little tug that's going out there and removing. This report. We started working on this report back in 2014. And rapid recharging didn't seem to be quite as viable then as perhaps maybe it is now. And so what it's doing is it's fetching a discharged battery pack from the bottom of the vehicle and then going ahead and replacing it with a new fresh battery pack. And yet, to keep this all reasonable and efficient and timely, again, things like an automated tug and an automated receiving station in terms of taking the discharged battery and then supplying a new battery is going to have to be as automated as much as possible, both from a safety, an efficiency, and a cost perspective. And those who haven't seen the Hopper report, you really should pull it off. All these reports can be pulled off of the Aeromechanics Office branch site, as well as not only my work, but other people's work within the branch, the office. And I highly encourage you that if you haven't done that, you should do that. And, talking about micro-rotorcraft and Aerobots as a ubiquitous part of society, I'm going to skip down to the bottom of the thing. I think there's opportunities to come up with all sorts of exotic vehicles that can transform their nature and do different things at different times that perhaps, if you were talking about much larger vehicles, wouldn't be realistic. But when you start going into the world of the small, things become possible that otherwise you didn't think they could be possible. And then I think that the end product, the very last bullet I have here, the end product of all this is to come up with these Aerobots or these aerial robotic systems that ultimately will seamlessly integrate themselves in society and provide many critical social need functions. And that's really, I think, the end game for all of us to try seeing this. We don't want any things that are intrusive. We don't want any technologies that we think are great only to help disrupt things. We want to be able to make things better, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. Again, disaster relief. This continues to be rotorcraft's finest domain and application, and it is my assertion that a synthesis of robotics and intelligent system technologies with rotorcraft will be an extremely powerful enabler. And again, there are several different references. This is a particular pet research focus area of mine. I wish, in fact, that there were more people who were actually actively engaged in this particular area. So if I had to have you have one thing that you take away that you want to say, I want to work more on, my personal recommendation is get more involved in this concept of using these assets in disaster relief and emergency response missions. That would be the main takeaway I'd like you to have out of this. And so this gets into SPRITES, which is, again, this idea of providing emergency response services. Right now, we're beginning to see that happening with, quadcopter vehicles that you can commercially buy. People will use them as imaging platforms for personal use or professional use, and now they're being dragooned into service for search and rescue, either on an on-demand need or else, public service organizations are purchasing and using them themselves. What's less known, and this is a presentation I did back 2 years ago, is that we're talking about investing a lot of energy into developing delivery drones, my argument is that, well, if you have these vehicles dropping off small packages all the time, why can't we find a way, or we should argue that we should find a way through networking technologies and vehicle design to allow them to upon need, upon emergency, deploy small aid packages to aid people when things bad happen. And so, again, another emphasis, which is it's great to talk about commercial applications of things, but let's not lose sight of the public service aspects. And keep in mind, if we're going to have these vehicles integrated into our society, you got to convince the public that there's value to them besides going ahead and getting a bag that ships to them faster and faster. You know, if in fact they can then, and upon need, actually provide critical first aid kits, communication devices, and other things like that, that would be a really powerful way to convince people that this is something that we need to move towards. And this gets in the idea, talking to delivery drones, that we need to rethink about, you know, multimodal aspects. So this is one proposal for a both combined aerial vehicle and a ground mobile vehicle. Getting close to my time, so I'm going to skip through this. But again, there's papers out there by myself and others within our organization that talk about this. And again, I encourage people to think about that. The key thing is, besides talking about the idea of, you know, hybrid mobility as being one possible route for efficiency of delivery drones, you know, it's a tightly coupled thing. You can have, you know, loose coupled integration where basically the vehicle just merely deploys a surface vehicle that's semi-independent. That's a loose coupling. Or you can have a tightly coupled situation, type integration, where the vehicle does it all. It has both air mobile and ground mobile. The other point is, people talked about rotable aerial vehicles for some time. My argument is that when you start talking, again, the world of the small, the world of slow vehicles, because you don't want them to go fast, you can make practical some of these rotable systems at the world of the small and modest, rather than, you know, the problems you have when you start talking about the big. And the final point on this that I would do is, my opinion is that what you're going to end up doing is you're going to be looking at trying to come up with the big vertiports to handle manned and automated platforms such as Hopper, but you're going to want to have a network of neighborhood landing sites, whether they're prepared or not prepared, highly prepared landing sites, where you can do this commerce, you can do this delivery thing, rather than the notion, I would argue, of trying to land stuff directly at the consumer's residence. Talk a bit about heterogeneous, distributed, modular, multi-rotor configurations. This is, to me, a really cool area for people who want to look at aerodynamics and aerodynamic interactions, where you start looking at 2- and 3-dimensional arrays and matrices of heterogeneous rotors that can be tailored for a variety of missions. And so I'd encourage you to not only look at this paper, but begin thinking about it. The image there is basically to a coaxial rotor configuration that primarily just provides lift. It doesn't have any cyclic control, and instead you have these outrigger maneuvering rotors that do the tilting of the vehicle, the attitude change, in order to have forward propulsion. Hybrid mobility, again, you know, bio-inspiration and robotics. You know, I know Georgia Tech has looked at things like having landing legs, robotic landing legs to land on uneven terrain and all that. One could extend that to talk about, you know, possibly providing ground mobility. You know, that's more speculative, but the point is that's the direction of the future, I think. Same thing, research, one of my students looked at pogo type of things. The very first robotic leg locomotion studies were using basically standalone pogo sticks that they were trying to control. And we looked at the fact, could you combine that type of mobility with rotary wing mobility to be more efficient in terms of overall power consumption. So that's just, again, reference and a pretty picture here. And again, this is a spectrum of things. You can almost pick and choose. Today, I want to design, you know, something that has, you know, liquid surface mobility, or tomorrow, and aerial mobility, or ground mobility and liquid surface mobility, surface interactive or not. And so that's the great thing, I think, for innovators is to realize that you can almost begin doing this pick and choose inspiration to begin to come up with all sorts of exotic type of configurations. Again, universal flying machines, this is trying to push things, again, it's very speculative. Instead of just thinking about swarms, why don't we start thinking about elements and collectives, make those both stationary and mobile. And again, an important area here is roboticists have relied a lot upon linear actuators and servos and electric motors to effect their mobility. You can also open the design space significantly by starting to say that instead the movement of a robotic limb may be partly enabled by using small micro-rotors that can provide thrust to do the actuation. And I think that would, if realized, enable some pretty powerful type of robotic system implementations. And that's really a new area I think that people, again, could kind of get into. And people are investing a huge amount of energy into humanoid robotics. And again, there's a real interest in doing that for rescue robots. And we could have this loose or tight integration of these type of humanoid robotic systems for those type of missions. The loose type of integration would be having, a humanoid robot basically using a personal flying platform that a human would use. That would be maybe tailored for that particular system in terms of its controls and everything. But basically, that would be loose integration. A tight integration is getting into the exotic things of, can you actually have the propulsors be on the humanoid robot? Can you even not only deploy them for flight, but also can you then stow them so that they can interact in the tight personal space situation you have when they're on the ground, when they're trying to do some sort of disaster relief activity. So another interesting area to think about. Again, it seems to be very speculative, but I'm talking about 20 years out. I want to inspire people to think what's going to happen 20, 30 years out now that nobody else or very few people are thinking about. And sometimes when you do that speculative stuff, you say, hey, that particular picture or that particular implementation is nonsense. But then if they're embodying the spirit of innovation that I'd like them to have, they would say, hey, but that might not work, but this might work. That type of integration might not work, but this middle range of integration might work. That's the kind of thing I'd like people to begin to start engaging with. I'm going to skip a lot through this because I'm late for time, but this is a whole area that I think that people need to think about. Bottom line is, how much autonomy do you need to provide in a system to be successful, and what technologies are necessary to do it? And ultimately it comes down to, these systems have weights, and how do you factor those weights into early preliminary design sizing for aerial vehicles? And to me, this is a really open area. I've done a limited amount of work, well, not a limited amount of work, but clearly there's a big investment that can be done in this area. I think needs to be done in this area. People talk about, gee, should we let, autonomous helicopters fly around on Earth? I'm saying one day, we're going to be sending interstellar probes into space, and they're going to be basically our representatives out there. And so how are we building that level of autonomy? How are we making a roadmap? And so that would be the quasi level 10. But in between it, there's a whole lot of things when I was talking about robotic ecosystems, robotic symbiosis, and stuff like that. All that needs to be also worked on as well. A lot of people, when we had this argument, wanted to have, limited level of, levels of autonomy, 1 to 5, 1 to 4, because they want it from a programmatic standpoint. But I want to be an expansive perspective. What is the end game here, 20, 30 years or more out there, and how do we get there? And along the way, are we going to come up with valuable autonomous system capabilities that are going to do, great things to our society? Not one size fits all metrics. We should make metrics. We should not get rid of metrics. Metrics are how we define and design things. I talked about design process fusion. There's a strong interest in robotics community for research on aerial robots. All you have to do is do a web search, and you can see them flying quadcopters all over the place. But we need to engage with those folks to have them both communities be successful. And as I indicated, that will result in design processes that will have to adapt, expand, and otherwise make that type of capability realistic. And again, let's do this for the good of society. So, concluding remarks. There's much promise, but also concern as to this ongoing fusion of intelligent systems, robotics, and aerial vehicle design. We have to be wise as much as we are smart. And so, for example, this particular comment originally back in 2014, when I did an early version of this, it was about privacy. How do we make sure that we're not impinging upon people's privacy? But it's more than that. And so, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do it. And if we still want to do it, then we have to think about how we mitigate the downsides of that. And the bottom line, this is not just say, let's have fun, let's go slap some robotic arms here and call it good. It's really ultimately, is this going to result in new services, new capabilities, new knowledge that otherwise would be impossible to get with just about any other type of approach. And that concludes my comments, so I'm open for questions. I'm sorry I ran over time. Hopefully we got time for a few more questions.
Thanks, Larry. Very interesting. So just an announcement. Most of us, I think by now, are pros at doing virtual meetings. You should see a meeting bar with a chat and a question bar. And if you have questions for Larry, would you type them in there? Everyone on this meeting except the presenters are muted. And we will curate the question bar and read them back to Larry for everyone's benefit so they can hear them. The first question that we have is about sort of semantics. Does transforming mean shape-shifting? And rotorcraft, in this sense as robots, do they refer to all sorts of VTOL aircraft or just, for example, single main rotor aircraft?
Okay, so that's a two-part. Let me take the first one. I think that I had the one picture where I had the single main helicopter with the chicken legs on the bottom of that. And the reason why I picked that particular chicken leg thing is there are folks, a company called Agility Prime that has a working system, walking humanoid robot that's using a technology similar to that. So yeah, I think that I would then go back to the expansive thing. I'm not limiting anybody to anything, any type of aerial vehicle that could somehow be employed in a surface interactive and or a ground mobile and or water mobile system, whether loosely integrated or tightly integrated. The sky is opening. I mean, I think the key thing I was trying to emphasize here, hopefully comes across, is I want people to open up their eyes and not to artificially constrain themselves to say that, well, this is what rotorcraft is, this is what robotics is, and the twain will never meet, okay? So if you come with an idea and it uses ducted propulsion, or even if you have, you're a big airship technology aficionado, if you can think about how you can do things that can interact with people, interact with objects on the ground, or do one of these societal need type of applications, more power to you. I look forward to seeing some of your work now in the future. As to the first part, transformative, it basically is encompassing a number of things. It can be shape-shifting, it can be reconfiguring for mobility. Let me give you an example. One of the cartoons I had was this idea that you would have kind of like an RC classic wing helicopter flying around, and you would gain the benefits of range and speed. Then it would land, and then it would have a mission to do some sort of ground surveillance. And there's a couple ways you can do it. You could do it kind of the loose integration manner by which the helicopter deploys a small little rover that takes off and does its own thing, which is kind of the utility concept that has long been within rotorcraft. Or alternatively, why couldn't you, if it makes sense, go ahead and start jettisoning the non-essential hardware components that comprise the vehicle. So you jettison the rotor blades and perhaps the hub. You jettison the tail rotor and the tail boom. And now basically you're still relying on the same electric motors, though you may have to have some sort of variable gearbox. You're relying upon the same power electronics, you're relying upon the same batteries. And so you have, in that mind, would be an example of a transformative type of system. But transformative, again, that's kind of the context I'm using. It's a fairly expansive one. It's something, again, I think really people can use that as a, not a rigid term, but a term that they can use, hopefully for inspiration to come up with their own ideas.
Okay, second question. Can you please comment on the programmatic aspect of how we go from an initial concept to an actual funded program, and how we shorten the associated timeline? Asking in the context, of course, of rotorcraft as robots, and also especially personal air vehicles.
Yeah, well, if I had the complete answer to that, I'd be doing quite well. It's the first thing I'm going to say is that you have to be persistent. And if you don't have a certain level of that persistence, if you don't think in terms of years rather than days or months, you're ultimately, I think, going to be a very frustrated individual. Up until 2014, never really appreciated the idea that maybe we would one day have a Mars helicopter fly on Mars. I, in fact, gave back in 2007, 2008, kind of a seminar at Ames where basically I was kind of quasi handing the torch to a future generation of researchers to work in that area, because at that time it just seemed like almost all the avenues that I had to try making something happen in terms of planetary rotorcraft seemed to have been exhausted at that point. So persistence, particularly when you're an innovator, particularly when you're trying to put out, I'm going to say quite, proudly, very speculative type of ideas and work and all that, you have to do that. Now, various different organizations do have pathways to innovation. I can say from my experience at Ames that there's a lot of bright people with a lot of bright ideas that run the spectrum of semi-speculative to very speculative, and so it's very hard to get your ideas up there. But again, there are avenues, and that's where it comes into play for possible programmatic visibility. The final thing is, and I'm going to be totally honest with it, it's partnerships. It's really, in the case of Mars rotorcraft, it was Ames and Langley and the Revolutionary Vertical Lift Technology project, partnering with JPL, that made it possible. If that team hadn't come together, I don't think ingenuity would have been realized, or at least not realized as early as it had, even though from my perspective it was not that very early. And I think that was kind of a subtext in the presentation I had today on rotorcraft as robots. There is a community of roboticists out there that are actively working with quadcopters and other exotic vehicles, and yet they're kind of doing it in a quasi-vacuum. Think how powerful it is if some of these people want to start interacting with those roboticists to get mutual synergy on what they're doing, as well as maybe they're funding opportunities that we as rotorcraft researchers don't see in this area, but there may be a whole gamut of research proposal opportunities from, the roboticist perspective. And so that's why I encourage people. I am, not only am I an IAA member, VFS member, but I'm also an IEEE member. And it's that networking and that reaching out to folks, I think, would make a difference. Now, in case of, personal air vehicles specifically, again, it's one of those long-term type of persistent things that I think that you just need to keep on doing. One of the key things that I've found is that you pick your anchor point on the particular speculative thing that you address. So in the case of the Hopper the Hopper proposal we did back starting in 2014 was we intentionally picked a fairly pedestrian tandem helicopter configuration, which is not to say you can't have advanced technologies in that, but by and large, people look at it and say, okay, tandem helicopters have been flying around for many, many decades. We intentionally picked it because we did not want the study to be dealing with the two speculative aspects of having an exotic vehicle configuration. At the same time, we were dealing with the relatively exotic type of concepts of, network systems delivering scheduled flights within an urban metropolitan area using electric propulsion, which we had argued we had the right mission for the right ranges that we were likely going to have. And so I think that would be the encouragement I would say for folks that are looking at things like personal air vehicles is, what are you really trying to achieve? Are you trying to come up with, you're really interested in a particularly exotic type of vehicle, or are you really interested in going after those type of operational considerations and efficiencies necessary to make it into some sort of, from the vehicle sense, a commercially sustainable vehicle product, or from an operator perspective, I'm trying to make it a commercially sustainable transportation business market. And so that's really what I would encourage people that are looking at a crowded field like personal air vehicles, UAM, et cetera, is what is really your priority from a technological business perspective? What are you really trying to achieve? And if it's an exotic vehicle configuration, go for it. If it's coming up with the most efficient type of network system to affect urban transportation, you really do what you can to skinny down to really address those fundamental questions.
Okay, maybe one more question, which comes from myself actually. For vehicles that really redefine our notion of what an air vehicle is, like these kind of like, I suppose one crude way of describing them is even like a Swiss Army knife where one tool happens to be flying, especially in the planetary sciences. Can you talk just for a minute about developing something that resembles a design mission or ConOps, sort of just from the starting position that we know we want to fly on a different planet somewhere off Earth?
Yeah, so, it may not seem like it, that, I'm throwing out here a lot of ideas, a lot of vehicle concepts. And again, so clearly the emphasis here has been, or seemingly has been, kind of all about the exotic, extreme engineering one could do if one went down this path. But ultimately, and unfortunately, we really didn't get this opportunity with Ingenuity, because Ingenuity always was intended to be a technology demonstrator. So again, it was very vehicle-centric within the secondary issue about deployment, which is a non-trivial type of issue that had to be addressed as well. How do you transport it there, and how do you get it safely on the ground so that it can fly? But having said all that, having said, oh, this seems like I'm just an idea guy here, I really do fundamentally believe at the core, it's all about the mission. That you have to define a compelling need, and then you have to define a set of compelling missions. Maybe you don't know what the best mission is, but given when you're dealing with this kind of emerging area, you do have the luxury of helping to define the missions in concert with defining the vehicles. And you use that to then entice the scientists in the case of Micro-rotorcraft and other planetary. Then you can take some of these missions, you can say, hey, this is some of the things I think you can do. And then they'll quickly, if you get them interested, they'll start throwing rocks at the idea and start asking both reasonable and unreasonable things of you that will then result in a more refined mission. But basically, right now, I think that any follow-on Mars science mission type of thing will fall into three general categories. One will be kind of a flyaway mission where you get the vehicle in there and somehow onto the surface of Mars, and then it will independently kind of complete kind of an aerial and ground surveying of the area. And likely that platform will have instruments that are surface interactive, i.e. when it's on the ground, it'll do something like take samples and image them as a minimum, and or analyze them if possible, given the mass constraints you got. But basically the rotorcraft, because it becomes a standalone entity, and that's why it's understated with Mars Hill ingenuity. It's understated that everybody thinks about being able to fly in that thin atmosphere, but the other really powerful, and all the aerodynamics, all the performance issues attended to that, but the other very powerful thing that Ingenuity is going to demonstrate is it's demonstrating all solar electric propulsion, which means basically it's by definition capable of doing multi-sortie flights. So that what it doesn't have, and its successors doesn't have, perhaps is the range and speed that one might want to have because of cooling conditions, say on electric motors or other factors like that. It will make up for being unable to fly one day and then a couple days later fly again and continue to successfully do it, as long as the system can continue to robustly survive the environment it's in. So theoretically, that's a very powerful thing. The second type of mission that's likely going to happen is going to be kind of a hybrid lander slash rover slash aerial vehicle tight integration, if you will, using it in this context that they have to work in concert in some manner. So again, what Ingenuity could have done, but can't do because it was designed as a technology demonstrator, is it could act as a scout for a rover. It could go ahead the next day, clear out a path for the rover, make sure that everything's fine, then allow the rover to safely proceed from wherever it wants to go. And similarly, you could have a more broad thing where the helicopter can be a sampling device to bring back specimens from the ground back to the lander, and then somehow have some sort of robotic transfer mechanisms enabled such that that sample is somehow passed along to the lander analysis equipment, and then analyzed and the results relayed back to Earth, and to continue to do that over the course of time. But the downside of that is that then by definition the aerial asset is wedded to whether it's the rover, which has some level of mobility, or wedded to the lander, which has no mobility. And so therefore you're by definition doing much more detailed mapping in more limited areas. So that's kind of the second category of vehicles that I see it. And then the last one is this idea. I know don't ask me when it's ever going to happen, but we will have a human presence on Mars one of these days, and then some of the restrictions, severe restrictions that we have in terms of the vehicle can't be too big, it can't weigh too much, it's got to have its own self-contained power. Those start fading away, and you can start conceiving much larger vehicles that perhaps require some assembly on the ground, whether it's robotic or human astronaut assisted. And then, like I said, if we are successful in developing rocket propellant, hydrogen and oxygen on Mars using in situ processing of regolith, well, you can use that same propellant not to drive a rocket, but return rocket to Earth, but you can use that propellant to then go ahead and to power a much more robust, much more power efficient combustion type system on board, a much larger Mars rotorcraft. And so then you start getting this area where, a Mars rotorcraft becomes an asset to the human exploration element. And some of that can be precursor type of stuff. You're on your way to getting to Mars, and so you lay some groundwork before that, and larger rotorcraft can be part of that. But also, ultimately, then it gets factored into the actual human presence and helping them explore, safely explore, and do things like that. And we actually, one time we had a paper in Pascal and a couple of books of Planetary Science that I actually looked at a human transportable, single astronaut rotorcraft, which was huge, okay, which is huge. It had to be ultra lightweight and everything else. It was basically, trust work with. It was very evocative in some ways of the human-powered helicopter stuff that we were working on a few years back. But the point is, not that I necessarily expect that that's going to happen, but the point is, it's not completely out of the realm of the possible. And who knows? Who knows? One day somebody may be realistic. You know, say we really realistically have to look at something like that. So that's kind of the third category. Far future, which we'll go back to.
So ordinarily, when we do a seminar like this, we would conclude with a round of applause and a gift from the chapter. Larry, I hope you'll take our sincere thanks and a rain check on that whenever we do all get back on site. But I'd like to thank you and everyone for attending as well. Like I said, no further announcements really, but stand by. I'm sure we will try to do another virtual seminar with another speaker in the coming months. Thanks again to everyone.